I start from the proposition that generally democracy is a good thing and that democracies seldom go to war with one another, notwithstanding Churchill's remarks in the House of Commons in November 1947 when he said, it's a famous quote, "Indeed it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." So my accolade for democracy is not that it leads inevitably to greater happiness and prosperity, and with fixed-term parliaments often sees some quite dramatic changes in policy direction, but that short of the direct form practiced in the small environment of the ancient Greek nation-state and demos, it enables the voice of the governed to be heard. We can argue about the responsibility of the parliamentarian to be either a mere mouthpiece for the prejudice of a majority of constituents, or to exemplify the adage of Burke some 250 years ago in his speech to the electors of Bristol on election day in 1774, that the parliamentary representative owes his constituents his judgment and conscience, but not necessarily owe them the total subjugation of his own views to theirs. In his view, MPs were elected to represent their constituents' best interests as determined by the MP's judgment, rather than simply to represent the wishes of a constituent regardless of his own judgment. That theory of representative democracy remains popular to this day with our elected representatives. As pointed out by a skilled observer of such matters, Sundar Katwala, in an article on the 14th of August 2019, a YouGov poll in the summer of 2019, however, showed that it is unpopular with the voters who elect them. Burke's theory of the role of the representative has 80% approval among MPs, but only 7% among the general public, where the idea of the representative as a delegate wins broad majority support. We see that argument amply demonstrated in the debate during and subsequent to the referendum on Brexit. With increasing use of modern electronic forms of gauging public opinion through change.org and other platforms, we can easily take a snapshot of public opinion on any particular issue. The problem is that it is precisely that, a snapshot with instant reaction, given mostly without serious thought or weighing of the evidence on both sides. In other words, if translated into execution, it is often a recipe for disaster as a knee-jerk reaction. In our everyday lives, we recognize that we can act in haste and repent at leisure. The public will is not always infallible and in any event can be mercurial and unreliable. In 1739, Britain entered into an ill-advised war with Spain, the so-called War of Jenkins' Ear, which was enormously popular, but of which Horace Walpole, our first Prime Minister, disapproved, exclaiming, "They may ring their bells now, before long they will be wringing their hands." Now, this is not to say that a parliament cannot also be swept by a tide of emotion into bad decisions, but at least as a manifestation of representative democracy, it is more likely to be a judgment based on evidence and dialectic argument. Despite its shortcomings, parliamentary democracy, albeit in many different forms, is now practiced in the majority of countries. A numerical tally is not particularly helpful, however, as some such countries pay only lip service to the essential tenets of a democracy based on free and fair elections and freedom of action by those elected. Indeed, in January of this year, the Economist Intelligence Unit, in its annual survey, which rates the state of democracy across 167 countries based on 5 measures, that's electoral process and pluralism, the functioning of government, political participation, democratic political culture, and civil liberties, found that democracy has been eroded around the world in the past year. The global score of 5.44 out of 10 is the lowest recorded since the index began in 2006. The sharpest decline in democratic freedoms occurred in China. Just 22 countries, home to 430 million people, were deemed full democracies by the Economist Intelligence Unit. More than a third of the world's population, meanwhile, still live under authoritarian rule. The danger of dissipating the admittedly sometimes tedious and seemingly indecisive deliberations of Parliament is that in the supposed interests of greater efficiency and effectiveness, it inevitably leads to decisions being taken by individuals rather than groups. Sometimes those individuals are elected leaders, but we've also seen the rise in influence of the special advisor and suspect that many decisions are being taken by people who do not necessarily even subscribe to the concept of parliamentary democracy. As an unapologetic advocate of this form of government, inefficiencies and all, I can only hope that modern technology enhances rather than supplants it. What is pleasing is that it seems that parliamentary democracy as a form of government remains on the march, with regional and transnational parliaments developing, often from very modest beginnings. Anthea can speak more authoritatively than I on the European Parliament, but in my lifetime, the Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community, created to ensure that the means of armaments fabrication no longer rested with the European nation states that had twice in a generation slaughtered their populations as a result, grew from a nominated body from existing parliaments into what we now see as a directly elected European Parliament with co-decision-making powers and scrutiny. Nearly all effective treaties have a parliamentary body to oversee their working, as in the Council of Europe, NATO, WTO, etc. There are many examples. We have the Andean Parliament, which represents 120 million inhabitants of the Andean region with functions including legislative harmonization in its member countries and permanent and active representation of the peoples of the region. And of course, in very recent times, the African Union, much modelled on the EU, and its Pan-African Parliament, whose members, like those originally to the European Parliament, are designated by the legislatures of their member state and are members of their domestic legislatures, including, incidentally, at least one woman. Some, like the ASEAN Inter-Parliamentary Assembly, are weak with only consultative powers, lacking legislative and oversight powers over ASEAN and its members. The important thing, however, is that they exist and, like the European Parliament, can develop. There are also the chances for parliamentarians to discuss across their national boundaries, such as the Inter-Parliamentary Union, which I've attended in the past. There are now many more opportunities for parliamentarians to meet their counterparts from other legislatures, and they take an interest in each other and their countries in a sympathetic way that often eludes normal diplomatic relations. In conclusion, we remain in the midst of a terrible pandemic, with decisions of enormous consequence to the physical and economic health of the nation and the world being taken by a miscellany of despots to democrats in different nation states. The difference between the two, of course, is that once the dust has settled, democratic leaders know that there will be the inevitable inquiry, probably from a parliamentary committee that is non-party politically partisan, taking evidence from a variety of scientific and other sources. This in itself acts as a constraint on actions that may have results that they can no longer control and which may have a significant impact on their own political future prospects. That same discipline is not applied to Xi Jinping, who has just enabled himself to be president for life, although he would have been due to step down in 2023. The constitutional changes were passed by the annual sitting of the Chinese Parliament, the National People's Congress, in March 2018. The vote was widely regarded as a rubber stamping exercise. 2 delegates voted against the change and 3 abstained out of 2,964 votes. It swept away the tradition that China had imposed of a 2-term limit on its president since the 1990s. Moreover, that democratic discipline seems not to apply to a Russian president who desperately seeks to contort his own constitution to reach the same conclusion. We should never underestimate the role of parliamentarians to scrutinize and draw attention to the nature and quality of governmental decision as a force for good in popular accountability. That is what we need now in dealing with transnational crises, whether they be a pandemic, and this will not be the last, sadly, climate change and the global environment, or cyber warfare. My organisation, as Margaret referred to, the World Federalist Movement, advocates a parliamentary assembly with powers of scrutiny rather than legislative authority to monitor UN institutions such as the World Health Organization, strengthening and empowering it. This would give voice to the preamble to the UN Charter itself, we the peoples of the United Nations, rather than just the states. Other groupings, such as the G20, should also have that parliamentary discipline. Hopefully, the tragedy of this pandemic will bring home to all people the fact that while decisions should be made according to federalist principles at the lowest level possible, locally, nationally, and transnationally, there are those which only can be taken globally in the interests of humanity as a whole. That includes preparation for the next pandemic, provision of protective equipment, adequate hospital space and medicine with equitable distribution so that the poorest and those without political power are not left out. Parliamentarians have a key role to play. They can put pressure on their national leaders. They can speak up in transnational parliaments. They can work across parliaments. They can encourage global leadership where presently we see none or that which is hostile to the world's governance. Parliamentarians understand the power of scrutiny and the shining of light in dark places. They are the voice of the people. We must do our bit to ensure that nationally, regionally and globally, they speak up and combine across borders to encourage the delivery of security that we also desperately need. Thank you.